And we keep things rolling here on the Sports Cubicle. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. He's the one. He's the only. He's Paul Shivari. And Paulie, we have had an awesome amount of guests talking about some important stuff here locally and around the sports world. And I think we have ourselves another great conversation for the listeners of the Sports Cubicle. What do you have coming up?
Well, today we have Professor Michael H. LeRoy from the University of Illinois to help us with the unionization of college athletes. It's a long road to go for college athletes. We know that there's been times in the past the Northwestern men's football team attempted this about 10 years ago. But earlier this week, the Dartmouth men's basketball team voted to unionize in a 13-2 vote in their election to join the SEIU Local 560, which some Dartmouth campus workers are already a part of. It brings in this great debate: are college athletes considered employees of their college? And here to answer that is Professor Michael LeRoy. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. And first off, do you consider college athletes to be employees of their university?
There are 520,000 NCAA athletes. Just think about that. That's a huge number. I don't think all of them meet the legal test for employment, but I think a significant number do. And to that point, I filed a friend of the court brief in Johnson versus NCAA. That's another case. It's not Dartmouth, but it more fundamentally poses the question: are college athletes amateurs or are they employees under the minimum wage law? And the key determinant of any employment relationship is whether an entity has control over your time, and the time that you spend is in the service of that organization. So whether you're a food truck, cashier, an NCAA athlete, or otherwise, that is the core definition of employment.
So where are we in that definition when it comes to whether they're employees, whether they're independent contractors? How fast can we get this type of definition, this type of clarification? Because there is so much money being made by these athletes for these universities. How fast can we actually get a decision in this matter?
Well, you and I might be talking about this 5 years from now without any resolution. It's a really long, slow process. And first of all, that's partly the nature of the National Labor Relations Board. It's got a multi-tiered structure. And employers, whether they are, Dartmouth or Amazon or Starbucks, and I pick out those two because they've had successful unionization efforts. They're 2 years past those, and the unions for those groups don't have any contract. But at least those folks are employees. The Dartmouth folks aren't. And with Johnson versus NCAA, even if this next case falls in their favor, it's 3 to 4 years down the road. So there's not going to be a quick resolution of this.
How important was this decision by the Dartmouth men's team to unionize, though, in comparison to when Northwestern tried this about 10 years ago? How important is it in the overall fight for unionization?
It's a big step forward, and let me tell you why. Northwestern, in their case, the players voted, but the ballots were impounded. They were never opened. Those players don't even know if they voted for a union or not. That just speaks to how these processes can be dragged out and sort of undermined in terms of what employees want to do. What makes Dartmouth unique is we had a vote. The ballots were opened. It's a 13-2 vote. I think that sends a signal to other athletes who are thinking along those lines. I think that's important. The other thing, and this is a legal thing, but your listeners should know this, the National Labor Relations Act. So it's under that law that we have the NFL and all the major sports leagues. Under that law, it only pertains to private sector entities. Well, Dartmouth is private sector, Northwestern is private sector. The NLRB ultimately said they don't want to move forward with the Northwestern case because the rest of the conference was public schools. You can't have a bargaining unit with one team. Just think if the Bears were the only unionized team in the NFL, and it'd be a pointless exercise. You have to have league-wide bargaining. Now, going back to Dartmouth, the Ivy League is all private. So in that respect, this fits under the federal labor law model.
You know, it's interesting, Professor. You talk about like that distinct difference between public schools, like you said, a U of I to Wisconsin, and then you have these private schools like Northwestern and Dartmouth. But I wonder then, what is the pushback from these public schools and these private schools when it comes to unionization? Because you hear stuff like they're going to cut certain smaller programs, especially ones that don't drive in revenue, almost as if they're using it as a a bargaining tool that if you want to keep these, we can't have you do this. What are the pushbacks from both private and public universities?
So that's one key point. That's a pushback point. And by the way, I spent the first half of my career looking at steel mills and auto factories and so forth. So the classic talk, whatever the industry is if you form a union, your plant, your workplace is at risk. We're going to disinvest. We're going to move. We're going to offshore your work. There's nothing new about this playbook. Now, let's talk about college sports. It's a fallacy that these institutions don't have money. And let me talk specifically about D3. That's not even in the conversation. People should look up Colby College in Maine. They built a $200 million athletic facility. They have 32 NCAA teams, and they use those teams. They're in Maine. It's cold up there, long winters. How are they going to attract students? You have to have a social life built around athletics. And my point is, whether you're a large school, a Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, whatever your school, or a smaller school, they advertise to prospective students, and look at their brochures. It typically features this kind of thing. They are in the business of promoting athletics. So even though they don't make money on it, and they don't, I acknowledge that, that's not the point. And I would also note for our listeners, there are many employers who are losing money. That doesn't excuse you from paying a minimum wage. You owe it. And what you do with the deficit is your business as an entrepreneur. So a lot of these arguments are really built on fallacies.
Have the pushback also included what's going on with NIL? I feel like for a while it was something that they were using as a bargaining chip to quote unquote, keep these student athletes, these stars that were going to be playing in all these different leagues, from, women's college basketball all the way to the Rose Bowl and these national championships. How much has NIL stopped, hindered, assisted what's going on with students, athletes trying to unionize?
Well, first of all, I think we would all agree that NIL has evolved in a way that nobody anticipated. It started off, if we remember, 3 years ago as an endorsement model. So you'd get the Haley Cavender, the Cavender twins would go out and they'd get a deal with Boost Mobile or somebody. They had a lot of social media followers. Now it's outright pay for play. The transactions just occur outside the province of the athletic office. That actually can be a hindrance to future organizing, because if people are getting enough money through NIL, what's the point? If we compare what Brock Purdy earned last year, he earned a league minimum because he was the last man drafted. If we compare that to the Tennessee quarterback, the University of Tennessee quarterback, he's on an $8 million NIL deal. It's crazy that you've got a freshman at Tennessee making $8 million and a Super Bowl quarterback making under $1 million. So, having said that, I also have a study on NIL where I found one school to share its database with me. They have to remain anonymous. They're not in the state of Illinois. But I found that 91% of the NIL money went to two sports, football and men's basketball. So when we talk about NIL, we're really talking about those two sports. I've got the data now, but listeners would say we're not surprised. That's unless we're talking about Caitlin Clark or somebody like that, we're going to be talking about NIL for football and men's basketball.
Are there any other private colleges or any other athletes from Dartmouth University from another sport that are talking about unionizing as well?
Well, yes. I had an athlete call me from an ACC school, and he said that he and others in the ACC are formally going to petition Congress. Now, that's not my place to share their story. But what I would tell you is that I think there's a quiet, simmering interest in doing it. Now, having said that, these are 18 to 22, 23-year-old people, and they've been coached since they were 5 years old in a sport. They're coached to respect authority. They should respect authority because of their youth, because of the limited time they play. And because they're just in a culture of deferring to authority, it's really hard to speak up. And one of the things that's going on in an NLRB case involving USC is USC, like most schools, has a strict policy on athletes communicating with the media. And that in itself sends a signal to athletes to zip it up. Don't talk about this stuff.
I guess when you look at the power structure of the NCAA, there's a lot of, it seems like power soaked up by some of the conferences, and especially now with some of these conferences like the Big Ten, pulling in, schools that aren't even geographically close to where the Big Ten started. When these schools go to eventually maybe try and work out collective bargaining agreements in the future, will it have to be conference by conference, or will it have to be overall under the umbrella of the NCAA?
This much I can say with 100% confidence. It can't fit under the NCAA's umbrella. I don't know how many conferences they have, but it's in the dozens, D1, D2, D3. What will eventually emerge is collective bargaining in something like the SEC and Big Ten. And I do think we're going to see eventually the decomposition of the ACC. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but take out a map of NFL cities and take out a map of what you've got in the SEC and the Big Ten, and you're going to see a lot of geographic overlap. And my point is, if you look at American sports generally, league structure, leagues have 30 to 32 teams. NHL, Canada, United States, similar kind of structure. So it varies from league to league. But all of these teams are in different time zones. They're spread out generally. They've got the rivalries. They've got the long distance kinds of things going on. Structurally, it just makes sense that at some point we're going to have a shakeout where you got 30 to 40 mega schools, and they'll be like the NFC and AFC.
Professor, we're talking about these new conferences like the Big Ten, the SEC, these new power brokers, essentially kind of weaning out, or for lack of killing off, the NCAA. And I wonder, in your opinion, what is it going to take, or will it take these TV corporations, the ESPNs, the NBCs, the CBSs that are sending out these major TV deals that are going to either hinder or push forward for the big two sports in March Madness, for men's basketball and for college football, even though we know there's a lot of fans of Caitlin Clark and women's basketball and all these other sports? Is it going to come down to that ESPN, Disney is spending billions of dollars and they want this resolved sooner rather than later?
I think that's where it's heading. Look, and I've spent my entire career on a wonderful university campus, and so we're in that discussion of the Big Ten. My perception is college athletics has changed from some sort of pretense of student athlete amateurism. I could see that early in my career in the 90s. It's evolved into a full-time business for the students. And I talk to students around the country, and they report to me during season, whatever the sport. It could be lacrosse, women's soccer, you name the sport. They're 40 hours a week at minimum practicing and traveling for games, minimum, and 20 hours during the off season. For football, it's more like 60. Now, directly to your question, what has changed is that the schools are now beholden to these TV executives. Look at the conference commissioners. Almost every one of them now is a TV executive. That's what they have in their background. So in my view, what college campuses have come to when it comes to sports is they are entertainment businesses. They're secondarily educational enterprises. Yes, people go to school. Yes, people get degrees. Yes, that's a wonderful thing. But that's the number one priority. It's keeping the TV executives and maintaining that revenue stream in the TV relationship.
You kind of casually mentioned earlier Johnson versus the NCAA. Where exactly is that trial at? How long do you think it'll be before we ever see a conclusion to that?
Well, I mean, I've been waiting. I've got a daily notice. This was supposed to be completed, sometime last summer. Oral argument was last February. We're now into 13 months later. It could drop any day. It'll drop sooner rather than later. Here's the long story short. If the ruling favors the NCAA, we're done talking about this. It's just over. The oral argument indicated that the NCAA was on the defensive the whole time, that the three judges were very skeptical of this amateurism model. They asked very hard-pointed questions, and the attorney for the NCAA, with one or two exceptions, had a very poor answer. I do think the athletes will get a favorable ruling. Now, that looks like a win. It would be a huge win. But then it would be sent back to a trial court. You'd have a 2 to 3 year discovery process where they would start the arduous task of line drawing. You know, it's easy to say, I'm going to use Penn State because they're in that geographic area. Penn State, that's going to be employment. What do you do with Duquesne? And then what do you do with Bucknell? I mean, Duquesne is sort of bigger than Bucknell. That's where the hard line drawing is going to occur. But given the way that case is structured, you're going to need resolution of large D1 schools, smaller D1 schools, D2, D3, and nobody knows how that's going to turn out.
I know it's way too early to predict, but do you foresee Johnson versus the NCAA eventually being decided by the Supreme Court when it's all said and done years from now?
Yes. I mean, to that point, I wrote an academic paper that tells attorneys how to brief that case if and when it comes up. I'm that confident that it's going to get to that level. And, you know, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, he wrote a concurring opinion that called the NCAA an illegal labor price fixing cartel. I just can't imagine. Not even in my academic writing do I use language that's that fiery and strong. That's his sense. And this was a 9-0 vote against the NCAA. It didn't have to do with employment, but the justices commented on this amateurism model. And whether you had Alito and Thomas on the right or Sotomayor on the left and Kagan, they all see it the same way. This amateurism model is a facade. It no longer is anchored in reality.
I think 2024 is going to be shadowed by the election that comes up between Biden and Trump. How big is the election outcome to the unionization of sports in the college ranks?
It's an astute question. So let's go back to Dartmouth. If Trump wins, this thing with the NLRB eventually gets shut down. There's no way. And I would say that if we had any Republican president, we've had moderate Republican presidents, we've had Republican presidents who have decent relationships with labor. Their NLRB is pro-employer, anti-union. Conversely, when we have Democrats, it goes the other way. I mean, they're almost mirror images of themselves. So part of it is Trump, but part of it really is that's just the nature of the beast. It's been that way since 1935. It will be that way into the foreseeable future.
He's Michael H. LeRoy. He's a professor of labor and employment relations at the University of Illinois. He is an expert on this subject. Professor LeRoy, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you on again as the story unfolds, because I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
I had fun talking to you guys. You guys take care.
Thank you.